Welcome, everybody. Let's get started. I guess we are just on time, so hopefully more people will join us soon. My name is Rasmus Heltberg. I am Lead Evaluation Specialist and Advisor at the World Bank's Independent Evaluation Group. And I am excited to welcome you to this webinar, where we will hear from two of my amazing colleagues, Jason Russ and Joy Butscher, on biodiversity. As you can see, the webinar is called Nature Positive Production, where climate and biodiversity meet. They'll be presenting two different reports with different perspectives, but both around biodiversity. We have half an hour, so let's get right into it. And Jason, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rasmus. And I'm really excited to have the opportunity to come here and talk to you about the importance of nature and biodiversity for productive systems and for the global economy. And to do that, I just want to give a brief snapshot of some new results that we released as a part of this report called Reboot: Development, the Economics of a Livable Planet. And in this report, we try to provide new evidence on many of the underappreciated win-wins when it comes to environmental protection and economic production and development. But before I go into those results, I thought I would take a quick snapshot to take a long view of the economy. And one of the things that we worry about very deeply at the World Bank is extreme poverty. And if we go back to the year 1980, which is around the time that we started measuring poverty with a standard metric, the extreme poverty rate was 40%. Today, it's down to about 8.6%. That's progress by pretty much any measure. Let's look at something else which is hugely important: infant mortality. Over the same time period, the infant mortality rate fell by 70%. That too is absolutely magnificent in terms of progress. And if we look at infrastructure, both access to water and sanitation has improved, access to electricity has improved. Both indicators are now more than 70% today. Of course, we want to get those figures to 100%, but there has also been meaningful progress. And if I had more time, I could show you many other indicators: food security, the cost of transportation, etc. And they're all moving in the same direction. So many might conjecture that there's never been a better time to be alive as a human. But that progress has come at a cost, and a very big cost to the environment. And we've been hearing discussions all week on the high costs imposed by climate change, so I'm not going to rehash those statistics here. Instead, I want you to think about the footprint of humanity in a different way. So let's consider the biomass, or the weight, of all mammals on Earth. And let's compare the biomass of wild mammals with the biomass of humans and the mammals that we consume, like domesticated cows, sheep, and pigs. And if you think about wild, these can be very heavy creatures, right? These can be hippos and whales and elephants. Many of these have more mass than multiple humans. So it could very well be that wild mammals make up 70% or maybe 50% of the biomass of all mammals. I want you to think about that, and I want you to think about what number pops into your mind. What is it today? And the answer is about 5% of mammal biomass is wild mammals. The remaining 95% are humans and what we consume. So you may ask yourself, is that normal? Has it always been like this? Is this what we should expect? So let's go back to the dawn of the Industrial Revolution in 1860 and see how things have changed. And in 1860, it was roughly 50% wild mammals and 50% humans and our domesticated mammals. Now wild mammals are vanishing 5%. So the footprint of humanity has been forceful. And much of these changes have been driven by what many would consider to be economic progress. And of course, it's not just been wild mammals that have suffered. The same pressures have been applied to our natural landscapes, especially our tropical forests. So this image is showing the Hansen data set of tree cover, which is a crude proxy for deforestation. And you can see just over the past 20 years or so, deforestation has surged all around the world. In the 2000s and 2010s alone, enough forests have been lost to fill a country the size of Argentina. And of course, we know that biodiversity loss and forest loss, these things are inextricably linked, right? Natural intact habitats are the strongest predictors of intact biodiversity that there is. Okay, so thus far I've talked about the impacts of economic progress on nature and biodiversity, but what about the reverse? Nature and biodiversity support economic progress. And there's many ways, and some will be discussed by Joy in the next presentation, but I wanted to highlight just one very big way that you probably didn't know about because the results are very new to this report. And it has to do with water. And when you think about fresh water, you probably think about water that's held in rivers and lakes and underground in aquifers and maybe even stored in glaciers and ice. And hydrologists refer to this water as blue water. And it actually only makes up about 35% of the fresh water on Earth. The remaining 65% of water is stored in soil moisture, and hydrologists refer to this as green water. And economically, green water is really important for many reasons. But one really important reason, is that about 70 to 75% of the world's agriculture is produced on rain-fed lands. So if your soil moisture is going wrong, then your crops aren't getting the nourishment that they need, your food production is going to go wrong, and that's going to have many downstream impacts on health, nutrition, productivity, etc. And so what I want to use the last few minutes of my presentation to talk to you about is the role of forests on supporting soil moisture. And there's a variety of views on how forests can impact soil moisture. Hydrologists have long argued that since forests consume water, that they actually act as straws, which reduce runoff as well as soil moisture. Ecologists, on the other hand, have long held the opposite views, that if you have an upstream forest, the forest can actually act as a sponge and retain soil moisture. And why might that be so? Well, forests have a canopy which intercepts rainfall. They have roots which distribute rainfall from wet areas to dry areas. And of course, as anyone who has gone out in the forest knows, there's mulch on the ground, and the mulch keeps the ground cool, which prevents water from evaporating. And up until now, you could find case studies which will tell us that forests act as sponges in one area or straws in another area. You could find results that show either. And that was until about 24 months ago when a new data set was put out on soil moisture. And so we took that data set and we just correlated it with upstream forest cover. And of course, this is a correlation. It's not a causal analysis, but the data shows that as upstream forest cover increases, so does downstream soil moisture. So globally, the sponge effect appears to be winning out. And now that we have this result, we can start doing some really interesting economics. So let's now bring in climate change. And we know that with climate change, we're going to get a lot more variable rainfall. So that's going to mean many more dry periods and many more wet periods. And indeed, the data shows that in many places on Earth, this is already happening. And so we asked ourselves a really obvious question. So we know that these dry shocks are happening, and we know that when they do, they impact agricultural yields, especially in areas relying on rain-fed agriculture. So we asked, when these dry shocks do happen, let's compare an area with low upstream forest cover with an area with high upstream forest cover. And if the conjecture that forests act as sponges is correct, then where you have high upstream forest cover, you have more soil moisture, and where you have more soil moisture, yields will be less affected by those dry rainfall shocks, and that will show up in economic growth. So what do we find? We find exactly what we conjectured. So the orange bars are showing the loss of growth due to a dry shock in areas with low upstream forest cover, and the green bar is showing the loss in growth in areas with high upstream forest cover. And in the green areas where you have more soil moisture, you're better able to adapt to the loss of rainfall, and your crops do better, and your economy is happier. So now that we've seen this, we can start getting really audacious. We can ask ourselves more interesting questions. So for instance, we can ask, does the kind of forest that you have matter? And indeed, there's an ecological literature behind the idea that natural forests are better than plantations or monocrop forests at supporting soil moisture. And so we can take that to the data. And indeed, the data again confirms that, where you have plantations in orange, the growth buffering effect is a lot smaller than where you have natural forests in green. And again, we can be even more audacious. We're often told that biodiversity matters for agriculture. So does it make a difference in this instance if your forest has high biodiversity or not? And what we find again is where you have high biodiversity in your upstream forest, you get very much more buffering compared to where you have low biodiversity. And why might this be so? I know many of you probably are not ecologists, but in the ecology literature, there's a theory called trophic cascades. And that tells you that everything in the food web is connected. So let me just give you a very quick example of that. A couple of decades ago, wolves were introduced to Yellowstone National Park. And the introduction of wolves, of this predator, led to declines in their prey, the deer population. The deer declines led to a recovery of vegetation around the rivers in the park because deers consume that vegetation. And that led to a recovery of the riparian ecosystems around the rivers. The rivers literally moved because of the introduction of wolves. And that's just one example of the power of a trophic cascade, that changing one aspect of the food system can literally change everything else. And now really quickly, and this is my last slide, to put it all together, we did a back of the envelope calculation on the benefits of upstream forests on agricultural yields and GDP. And we found really, really big benefits, about $380 billion per year. So to put that another way, that would be the annual cost of destroying these natural forests or the biodiversity that they support. And these are benefits that up until now have been completely unknown and therefore ignored by policymakers. And that tells us that we're seriously underestimating the economic impact of forests and biodiversity. And here we're not talking about future benefits, we're talking about benefits in the here and now that are happening every year. And with that, thank you very much for listening. Let me now turn the floor back over to Rasmus.
Thank you very much for that, Jason. What interesting and compelling evidence there about forest cover, links to water cycle, soil moisture, biodiversity, and ultimately the resilience of production systems to drought. Now over to Joy to continue talking about biodiversity, specifically an IEG evaluation report of the World Bank's support for biodiversity.
Thank you, Rasmus. Thank you, Jason. Just please confirm that you can hear me and see the slides. Good morning, everyone. I'm Joy Butscher, an evaluator with the World Bank Group's Independent Evaluation Group. And our team recently completed a major evaluation, Biodiversity for a Livable Planet, which covers 15 years of bank group support for biodiversity in conservation and production landscapes. Today, I'll share some key findings, focusing on how the World Bank and IFC integrate biodiversity into agriculture and agribusiness, forestry, and fisheries and aquaculture. And because Jason set the scene so profoundly, I'll try to move really quickly into the evaluation evidence after just some brief context. So production systems are at the front line of both nature loss and climate risk. They're central to national development, livelihoods, and food and nutrition security, but they're also central to land use change, overexploitation, and pollution. The literature and Jason's publication just confirms that biodiversity and ecosystem services underpin the basic functions that these sectors depend on: soil fertility, nutrient cycling, water regulation, watershed and coastal protection, pest and disease control, and pollination, which supports 75% of global crops. By shifting to sustainable, nature-positive, and climate-resilient production, we can protect and restore the natural assets that economies depend on. Climate-oriented solutions alone do not guarantee biodiversity gains. For example, a drought-tolerant monocrop, or a fast-growing tree plantation, or coastal aquaculture can each solve one problem while deepening another. They can produce short-term gains while weakening long-term resilience. The core message is simple. Climate resilient doesn't automatically equal biodiversity positive. To be durable, interventions in production systems must deliver simultaneously climate, nature, and human development gains. Very quickly, our evaluation examined how well the World Bank and IFC integrate biodiversity into production sectors, and we looked across fiscal years 2015 to 2024. We used literature and portfolio reviews and 6 country case studies in Brazil, Cote d'Ivoire, Ecuador, Mozambique, Peru, and Vietnam. Beginning with agriculture and agribusiness, we found that while few cases where biodiversity has been integrated into World Bank and IFC agriculture and agribusiness activities, they demonstrate that economic and ecological win-wins are possible. Over the evaluation period, we found a sharp increase in climate-smart agriculture approaches, from 30 to 90%. But not all CSA is biodiversity positive. High-input approaches can still degrade soils, water, and ecosystems. Biodiversity-positive approaches remain limited across the portfolios. In the World Bank, 7% of agriculture projects explicitly integrated biodiversity-positive design and metrics, such as crop diversity, soil quality, reduced agrochemical use, or sustainability certification. In IFC, 25% of agribusiness investments and advisory projects included biodiversity-positive features, mainly certification and traceability schemes in vertically integrated businesses with sustainability commitments. When these approaches were applied, they delivered multiple benefits. In China, fertilizer and pesticide use dropped sharply. On-farm tree cover increased. Yields rose by 8% and farmer incomes rose by 14%. In Panama, biodiversity-friendly production was scaled across 1,600 hectares with a 36% internal rate of return for 33,000 beneficiaries with strengthened business alliances. In Vietnam, technology packages cut agrochemical use up to 48%, increased profits by 32%, and cut greenhouse gas emissions. Across these and other cases, our findings are consistent. Biodiversity-positive production can strengthen productivity, resilience, and profitability. But these models haven't been replicated and scaled yet. They're concentrated in a handful of countries or progressive firms. Moving on to forests. Climate mitigation, avoided deforestation, and increased revenue results are material, but the forest portfolio offers limited assurance of biodiversity outcomes. Forests are critical carbon sinks. I don't need to tell this audience that, and you know that they're being degraded. In the bank's forest carbon portfolio, avoided deforestation and sequestration targets were far exceeded. This shows strong climate mitigation performance. But restoration of degraded forests was far below ambition at 8% of the target. And biodiversity-related outcomes could rarely be verified. So sustainable forest managed plans were often prepared, but few tracked implementation. Species composition and mixed species composition in afforestation and reforestation efforts or certification and traceability were rarely reported on. Again, cases show what's possible when biodiversity and livelihoods are pursued together. Here are a couple of examples from West Africa, which is at the frontier of commodity-driven forest loss. In Ghana, mosaic restoration increased farm yields by 25% and improved tree nursery income. In Cote d'Ivoire, the FIP restored over 22,000 hectares of degraded forest, reintroduced native species, and strengthened tenure in cocoa agroforestry landscapes. These examples underscore the importance of forest composition, secure tenure, and livelihood outcomes. Lastly, moving on to fisheries and aquaculture. There has been progress advancing elements of fisheries management with potential biodiversity gains, but tensions persist. Projects often struggled to balance long-term stock recovery with short-term livelihood and food security needs. Unsustainable fishing and aquaculture continue to drive biodiversity loss and long-term productivity decline. Around 38% of global fish stocks are overfished, and coastal ecosystems and livelihoods are under intense pressure. About 45% of World Bank fisheries projects aimed for ecosystem-based management, driven mainly by the environment global practice, with much lower uptake in the agriculture global practice, reflecting this tension between the need for stock recovery and production goals. Similar to forests, fisheries management plans were frequently developed, but again, reporting on implementation and ecological indicators was inconsistent. Still, the evaluation identified important success cases. Swayafish reduced pressure on overfished stocks while improving incomes and employment for small-scale fishers. And in Ecuador, IFC supported cleaner, more biosecure shrimp aquaculture, which improved water quality, disease outbreaks, and helped Ecuador become a competitive and more environmentally responsible shrimp producer. Again, these show that sustainability and competitiveness can reinforce each other when regulatory, financial, and institutional conditions are aligned. So across these sectors, we identified 4 key factors that enable integration of biodiversity into production. First, interministerial collaboration, especially between environmental and production ministries, and channeling of new information about applied research and technologies to extension services, firms, cooperatives, and resource users. Second, alignment of public and private finance with emerging sustainability regulations and markets, such as the EU regulation on deforestation-free products, which help create economic incentives for biodiversity-positive production. Reducing upfront adoption costs and buffering risks with innovative financial instruments, as well as strengthening land and resource tenure rights, was the third enabling factor. Fourth, and finally, identifying and targeting ecological tipping points as entry points, places where soils, forests, or fisheries are already hitting biophysical limits due to overexploitation, and where biodiversity-positive approaches can restore natural capital, productivity, and jobs. In conclusion, and based on the evidence, IEG recommended, and the World Bank and IFC agreed to the recommendation to proactively replicate and scale proven biodiversity-positive production models that deliver ecological, economic, and social outcomes. This entails, as I said, the 4 enabling factors, using policy, regulations, finance, and market signals to shift incentives for producers and firms and enable uptake. Tailoring successful interventions to local, ecological, and cultural contexts. Strengthening extension systems and firm-level advisory to diffuse biodiversity-positive practices, and building robust monitoring and adaptive learning systems so biodiversity, economic, social outcomes can be measured, not just assumed. And with that, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that, Joy. Let's go straight into questions. We have about 7 minutes left. Joy, there's a question in the chat for you about how to measure avoided deforestation in the context of these projects. And Jason, to you, I would like to ask you what is the outcome you would like to see coming out of the COP as relating to biodiversity? And others, please put your questions in the chat. Joy?
So Melvin, I see your question, and I'd be very happy to get back to you. To be honest, I would have to look at the methodology that the bank uses to really measure this. And you know how the forest carbon funds, the FCPF and the FIP, how they exactly do this. To be honest, I can't answer that question off the top of my head, but I'd be happy to look into it while you pop over to Jason.
So this is in the context of projects that have their sort of results framework and do their own measurement. Right. Jason? Right.
So we rely, a bit more context, we rely on the reporting of bank projects, and we don't do actually the avoided deforestation calculations ourselves, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So if I can jump in. So the question to me is what tangible outcome I'd like to see at the COP. And I have to say, when it comes to environmental change, the one thing that we see time and time again is that the precursor to change is the disclosure of information. In the US, the Environmental Protection Agency was only established after Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, came out, which introduced many Americans to the environmental harms that up until then had really been invisible. And once that information came out in the open, it really reshaped public expectations and political priorities so much that even a Republican president, Richard Nixon, felt compelled to create the EPA. Another example on information disclosure we see happening today is in China. One of the fastest air quality improvements in history has been happening over the past 10 years in China. And it started with something very, very simple, just automatic pollution monitoring. And the moment real-time air quality data became public, two things happened. The first was citizens suddenly understood the scale of the problem and demanded action. And the second is that local officials who could no longer hide poor readings now had powerful incentives to reduce pollution. And so that transparency, just making the invisible visible, really triggered a wave of reforms and investments that really cut particulate pollution and has shown a dramatic decline in air pollution. So coming back to the question, a meaningful outcome of the COP, of this year's COP or any COP, I think would have to follow the same logic. I would love to see countries commit to bringing environmental information directly into the decisions that ministries of finance and planning are making every day, not as a side report or a pilot, but actually as a core part of the environmental and economic planning. That means integrating natural capital indicators like soil moisture that I talked about, or forest conditions, or water stress, right into the same dashboards where we're using to track fiscal deficits or GDP growth or inflation. Because really, if you can't see, no one can see that all the soils are drying, right? You can't be everywhere in the country at once. It's very difficult to notice. It's difficult to notice if your forests are degrading or your watersheds are failing. But when you make that information available to people, you can then design growth strategies that actually target them.
Thanks, Jason. I love it. It reminds me of at the heart of evaluation is this belief that making reliable information available to decision makers and to the public in a systematic and sort of periodic basis is the basis for democratic governance and better decision making, better societies, better organizations. And what you said reminds me of that. Joy, from your perspective, and I know you showed the recommendations, but what would you like to see the World Bank, NIFC do differently when it comes to biodiversity?
I mean, other than, taking on the recommendation, which they have agreed to, I mean, I would like to see in general across the bank group and other MDBs, a better bringing environment and economics and climate together, bringing our various global commitments towards the environment, towards the climate, to poverty reduction, bringing all of those commitments together with a view on long-term sustainability and durability of, all of our economic sectors. And that requires, doing the kind of work that Jason and his team did, showing the economics of it and showing that this is not a niche environmental priority. This is really the foundation of our economies. And in the long run, while we might have to provide financial instruments to enable that kind of uptake and not be unrealistic about it, but really provide those enabling pathways so that we can course correct, for long-term sustainability of our economies. I think that's a bit big picture, but that's kind of what I would like to see. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a few seconds left. Jason, any final words from your side?
Sure. Yeah. And maybe this touches on the question in the comment. I think when it comes to our development models, I think they're quite outdated. I think there's this old adage that countries can grow now and clean up later, right? And I think that's based on this historical evidence that, or this historical idea that countries start out with pristine environments, and it's only the industrialization process where you start getting these challenges, these environmental issues. And it's already when you've started to grow, when you've started to get a little bit wealthy, that you need to deal with these environmental issues. But that's not what we're seeing today. We're seeing even low-income countries. In our report, we show that 90% of people living in low-income countries are suffering from degraded lands, from hazardous air, and from water stress. Okay, so these environmental issues, they're starting a lot earlier. And I think we really need to change our mindset on how we deal with these issues. Not that it's some nice to have side issue, but it's actually a core part of development. And so we need to be solving environmental and economic development issues together.
And that's a perfect note on which to end. Thank you very much. And thanks to our audience. We are just a little bit over time. The
Thanks, everyone.
reports are publicly available, and anyone can hope some people will read them. Can someone drop the links in the chat to the reports?
Yeah, yes.
Thank you very much.